Ashbaugh is a professor of history at SUNY Oneonta, a former Fulbright lecturer in Japan. His teaching and research include medieval China, Japan, as well as the coming of the Second World War, which is very apropos here. He's going to speak on an act unprecedented, HenryStimson and the first U.S. peacetime draft, 1940.
So I'm going to start off by saying that's not what I'm going to talk about. Unprecedented, New York Republicans, preparedness, and the first peacetime draft in 1940. As I was doing the research for this, I think we probably all go through this. Where you stand, it's kind of that Graham Allison statement, where you stand depends on where you sit. I was sitting in the archives looking through the Stimson Doctrine documents, and I decided, well, he must be the most important person in the world when it comes to the draft. And then I went through the James Wadsworth papers, because the name of the draft bill is the Burke-Wadsworth Act, and I think, well, he must be the most important guy. And then I read an article about Granville Clark, and he must be the most important guy, and so I decided all three of them are the most important guys, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. It had been a long, hot summer in D.C. Tempers were beginning to flare. Observers in the galleries were yelling, causing havoc, like that ever happens in D.C., right? On that September 4th, 1940 day, a bill had been before the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate that was very divisive, but was not partisan at all. Should the United States, due to the war in Europe, start something unprecedented? Should it have its first peacetime draft? Democratic Representative Martin L Sweeney of Ohio had just finished his speech denouncing the proposed law. Remember, that's what Wilson told us. You won't let our boys go overseas to fight. That's exactly what happened. You let Roosevelt have these troops, and he'll get us into a war. He went to go sit back down again, very close by a Beverly Vincent, the representative from the state of Kentucky, and under his breath, the representative stood up and said, "I'm not sitting next to this traitor." And Sweeney said, "What'd you say?" And Vincent said, "You heard me, I'm not going to sit next to no traitor." In the Time magazine, they put little dots for what they think he said as "son of a bitch" was what I figured out. And Sweeney took a swing. Vincent ducked, he was 5 years younger, and punched him in the face so hard that the doorkeeper for the House of Representatives said it was the greatest punch he ever saw or heard in all 60 years working at the Capitol. The swinging and the cussing continued. Both ended up with bloody noses, and they were forced to apologize afterwards as their compatriots dragged them off of each other. So, this paper talks about a group of New York Republicans that, plus a few others sympathetic to the cause, who decided that the world, the United States, needed some protection. Nazi Germany had, well, what the start of the story will have just started its wars of aggression, and as the story continues, we'll have taken over France and started attacking Britain. The most famous guy among historians who had something to do with this was a man by the name of Granville Clark. He's a very interesting character. He never served any roles in government except for an unpaid one during World War II for 4 years under Stimson. But he knew everybody, and everybody knew him. Granny was everywhere. And he used those connections to help try to sway the laws. And the other two guys I want to talk about are HenryStimson, who was former Secretary of War and Secretary of State, and then will again be Secretary of War under FDR, and James Wadsworth, an upstate New Yorker from a very wealthy family, an outdoorsman like Stimson, who had been senator for 2 terms in New York, and then went back to the House of Representatives, which is kind of strange. It doesn't happen very often. There's only a very small handful of politicians who do that, and ended up being the one who took charge of the bill that led to the Select Training and Service Act of the draft. All right. So what originally happened was Granville Clark and a bunch of his friends were people that served in a preparedness movement By the way, how much time do I have? 20 minutes, all right. And I'm 7 minutes in?
12, 20.
Okay. Can you tell me when I have 3 minutes left? I will. All right. He had served in, a bunch of these men had served in the Plattsburgh training camps, a way to prepare for war when they worried about the war in Europe back in World War I. They had decided it was the 25th anniversary of when they first formed, and they were going to do something to commemorate it. And after a bunch of talk, Granville finally stood up and said, why don't we just do it again? We're in a worse boat now than we were when we did this the first time. Why don't we prepare for the next war? Why don't we do something? And everybody got really excited, decided to have another meeting. Clark had known Roosevelt. He'd known him since they were both kids. They both went to Harvard together. They both worked in the same law firm for a while. But Granville was on the outs with the president because he had been one of the key guys to thwart the court packing scandal. Something I think we'll hear about court packing again in the not too distant future. So he told him about his idea. Why don't we bring back conscription? Why don't we bring back preparedness? Why don't we bring back the training camps so that we get our elites, the people who know how to lead, to learn how to lead soldiers? And so that's what started out, along with some other fellow Republicans, including Colonel Julius Oak Sadler, who was a decorated World War I veteran, general manager and vice president of both the New York Times and the manager-president of the Chattanooga Times, who theoretically is not really a Republican, but he leans that way, and so I'm putting him in that group for various reasons. I can get into that if you guys want to ask. The others are John F. Orion, who was head of the 27th Infantry Division during World War I. He had actually risen from the ranks from the National Guard to the commanded division, which was very, very unusual. And who else would I want to talk about? Oh, and William Donovan, the Wild Bill, who eventually founds the CIA and the USS. All these guys will play a role in this, although I will argue that the other people are more important. All right, so Granville decides he needs to get to the top. He needs to talk to General George Marshall, who's the chief of staff of the Army, and tell him that we need a draft. But he gets ignored. Essentially, Marshall tells him, look, I do what the civilians tell me to do. The military doesn't tell civilians what to do. It's the other way around. This is America. And Granville says, look, you got a problem here. Bad guys are coming. The situation is dire. You have to advise the president about what's the right thing to do. So that encounter does not go well. Marshall is very angry that this man is telling him what to do. So he goes off and he thinks about it for a little while. And he realizes that what Marshall was saying wasn't just that the president wasn't necessarily into the draft. The president actually wanted to do some kind of universal service that would send some people to the military, but others to learn vocations in industry, kind of an expanded CCC program from the good old days of the New Deal. But it also was the fact that Harry Woodring, the head of the War Department, was an isolationist, and there was no way he was going to get through this. So he decided that they need to do three things. They need to, number one, get a new Secretary of War. Number two, pass a draft, a selective service bill that doesn't take everybody into the military, because that would be disastrous for American industry. We're the arsenal of democracy after all. We need to send those planes and ships to the British to help them keep fighting. And number three, we need to recreate the Plattsburgh movement. And so that's what these guys work on together. And the good news is Justice Frankfurter of the Supreme Court is friends with everybody. Granville, Stimson, Roosevelt. And they get the idea that they could probably get Roosevelt, who doesn't really like to fire people, he likes them to quit angrily instead, to fire Woodring and to stick HenryStimson into the position. And Roosevelt has an additional reason to do this. He wants to run for president for a third term. And if he can create some kind of bipartisanship when it comes to the field of defense, that would be one good way of doing it. And of course, we all know that's exactly what happens. He picks Stimson to be Secretary of War and Frank Knox to be Secretary of the Navy. I think on the bad side of that, that means that whenever we have Democrats in positions of power, they oftentimes stick the national security apparatus to Republicans, but we never see the reverse happen. So I think there's some bad news about this in the long run. So it turns out that Stimson got excited about this whole campaign for the draft much earlier, and so he's on board once the president asks him to join. And Clark starts to work out how to create the actual bill that will be sent to Congress. And he works on this for a while, and the Selective Trading and Service Act of 1940 he finishes just on time to watch the Italians decide to get involved in the Second World War by stabbing the French in the back and finishing off any hope for France to hold out during the Second World War. They continue to play around with the documents, and they find someone who's willing to be the spokesperson. Edward Burr, who's a lame duck senator out of Nebraska. He got primaried essentially. He was a very anti-New Deal, but he's a Democrat. He'll be the voice in the Senate. He has nothing to lose. And Wadsworth, who had done a lot of work for the Senate Military Affairs Committee when he was in the Senate for 12 years, and had actually worked out a defense bill in 1920, and had tried to pass universal training back then, decides he'll be the voice in the House. Now, Julius Oak Sadler starts to use the New York Times to its best effect by propagandizing both the idea behind conscription as well as the idea behind a new Plattsburgh movement. And although at first Marshall is dead set against this, all of a sudden he changes his mind. He says, fine, for 4 weeks you can go have your businessmen go out there into the woods and play soldier, as long as they pay for it themselves or your organization pays for it, or a combination thereof, which is what was finally agreed to. So for 4 weeks, that's what's going to happen. After that, however, Marshall becomes a wet blanket on the whole thing. He prevents them from meeting again in September, and the following year, he actually threatens to resign if Stimson tries to force him to recreate Plattsburgh, under the argument that there's enough officers to go around. The best way to pick officers is to have the officers train young recruits and pick the best leaders of those young recruits instead of a bunch of old businessmen. And that if he doesn't listen to the advice of the military, he's going to quit. All right, what changed Marshall's mind? Most likely it was the president's appointment of HenryStimson as Secretary of War, which wouldn't take place yet, of course, because you have to go through the Senate before you're confirmed. Stimson had given some radio addresses about why we needed both compulsive draft and also that we needed to do everything we could to help the British and preparedness. So when he took the job, he told the president, look, you can't make me do anything partisan for you. I'm not going to try to help you in re-election, but I'm totally willing to do what I can to help this country in a time of potential war, and that was good enough for the president. On the flip side, the Republicans were going through the nominating process first. The Republican convention happened in the middle of June. Maybe it was the early part of July, I suddenly forget. But anyway, the fear was, because so many of them were isolationists, that an isolationist was going to come out of the Republican Party, and that would make it very difficult to pass this bill. It would become a partisan bill rather than a nonpartisan bill. But lo and behold, the dark horse, Wendell Willkie, the guy with the gray hair, managed to win the primary. Comes out of nowhere in the sixth, not the primary, but in the sixth vote of the nominating convention, and he is an internationalist, so he is happy to go along with this. this, although it takes them a while to come out publicly and actually say he's going to do this. Well, the biggest problem as this bill winds its way first through the Senate and then into the House is the argument that I talked about earlier, the Fisticuffs. This was a pretty contentious issue. Those who were against the building of the military said, look, it's un-American. If you have a country that's free and you suddenly make somebody do something, that's not American. The counter to that, of course, is if you receive the benefits, you're a citizen, you owe obligations to the state. The other idea is the Germans aren't really a threat. The Atlantic Ocean is really big and it won't really cause any problems, even if the British fall. Now, the problem with that theory is something that I discovered looking through the Stimson Doctrine, the Stimson documents, and that is in the summertime there is a massive maneuvers held on the border between New York and Canada. And during those maneuvers, they actually bring over the Canadian Prime Minister and they talk to him about what to do should the Germans try to attack. And the underlying current here is, what happens if the British surrender? Does Canada automatically surrender too? Does that mean that the largest undefended border in the world is suddenly open to Nazis to walk across and get into this country? And so I really think that's what the big fear that motivates Stimson into getting this particular bill through at any cost, is this fear that even if Canada doesn't surrender when Britain surrenders, the fact that British ships might turn into German ships and the ocean isn't as big as we think it is, could lead to attacks along the northeast coast, not of the United States, but the northeast coast of Canada, and then an invasion southward by the pineapple. And so those are his big fears that he spells out in his diary. The other argument is that, the anti-argument against the draft is that really, you guys are just a bunch of tools of Wall Street. This is kind of the argument made by our good friend, the Marine Corps, Smedley Butler, right? Smedley Butler says, I was a gangster for capitalism. So that's the other argument, is that you guys are a bunch of rich guys, a bunch of Wall Street lawyers, you just want to protect your investments. So we should stop speaking from you. Those in favor of the draft said a citizen army is better for a democracy than a standing army is. Donovan noticed that a lot of soldiers didn't know how to put on their gas mask or use their bolt action rifles properly in France. And he said that's something we can't do again. That would be really, really bad. So we got to do something to fix this. Eventually, Roosevelt gets nominated for president through some trickiness. There's a great book called 1940 that has a little bit to tell about that story, written by Susan Dunn. That's worth reading if you want the full story of how Roosevelt ran for the job without really running for the job. And slowly but surely, the bill starts to wend its way through Congress and manages to go through, and it turns out that those who are against it can't stop it, but they can ruin it by saying, let's just leave it aside for a little while and do more volunteers. Let's have more volunteers first. Let's make sure volunteering doesn't give us the right numbers. But really, they're just trying to kill the bill by slowing it down. So they managed to thwart those guys. They changed the age numbers from 21 to 35. 35 happened to be the oldest age you could be to join the Army. Those are the years. Now, what's ironic about all this is, as it goes into effect, Granville Clark takes a lot of the credit for this. But in 1948, when they tried to bring back the draft, Granville Clark will be one of its biggest opponents and will argue against it. Granville Clark, a Republican, he said he was born into it, starts to advocate for world federalism, as does, for a little while, HenryStimson. So here you have Republicans behaving in a way that, if it was to happen today, not only would they be considered rhinos, they would be considered crazy people. They would even claim to be Republicans for the idea that that we somehow could work with other countries in a world federalist government. So Granville Clark will spend the rest of his life trying to prevent things like Vietnam from happening, which he does not not due, but he dies in 1967, at the same time of the founding of this here university.